Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rhonda McEwen. I am President and Vice Chancellor here at Victoria University and the University of Toronto, and I warmly welcome you to what is our inaugural Coxford Lecture at Victoria College. Thank you for being here. As we gather, we acknowledge and respect this beautiful and sacred land on which Victoria University operates, to recall that it has been a site of human activity for thousands of years is quite incredible. This is the land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Since it is the land upon which we celebrate and learn today, I think it's important to acknowledge, but also remember that land acknowledgements are not enough. We must continue to do the work to right historical wrongs and learn from our past. Growing up in the Caribbean, I was not familiar with the traditional names of the First Nations here in Canada. And as an immigrant, I take responsibility and opportunity to commit myself to the struggle against systems of oppression and to support the self-determination of the peoples of the land, an outcome that is familiar to me both because of my ethnic roots, but also based on my belief in human rights work across the world. We are delighted today to launch this new named lecture and to name it after one of our remarkable Victoria graduates, Stephen Coxford. Stephen Coxford is a lawyer, an incredible business mind, but also someone who has always been passionate about igniting discussion about big ideas. We are here today because of his generosity. And we thought, who better than to have our first lecture than Mark Carney, which would fulfill Stephen's passion. Mr. Carney is a household name, not just in Canada, but around the world. He is the UN Special Envoy on Climate Action and Finance. As chair and head of transition investing at Brookfield Asset Management, he leads the company's environmental, social, and governance investing strategy, with a particular focus on accelerating the transition to a net zero economy. He has served in the prestigious role of governor, both at the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England. He's a respected business leader, having worked at Goldman Sachs in London, New York, Tokyo, and Toronto before going into public service. And his academic credentials are stellar, having completed his undergraduate at Harvard and a doctorate at Oxford. Mark Carney has championed ethics, values-based approaches to business, and these are things that make it clear that the business world can and should be a partner in addressing climate change. From the day I became the president here at VicU, I can unequivocally say that the most ardent and passionate and urgent rallying cry from our students, and many, many are here today, has been a demand to address climate change. Whether advocating for VicU to divest from fossil fuels, which I'm happy to say we have not only committed to but have begun, or exploring ways that we can be more sustainable on this beautiful campus, student voices are shaping our approach to safeguarding our planet. Our students at VicU and University of Toronto are successfully galvanizing the world to pay attention, and we are seeing momentum in finance and across many other sectors of business. Addressing climate change certainly requires will, but also a commitment from the global community, including those in corporate life. But it will also need creativity, innovation, and vision. It needs people to go beyond and challenge the status quo. This past weekend, Victoria College professor Ira Wells wrote a powerful piece, front-page article in the Globe and Mail's report on business with the headline, "Focusing on STEM degrees has its own economic cost." If you have not already read it, I recommend it. He illustrates that the business leaders around us are sounding the alarm that professionals are increasingly ignorant of history, philosophy, and literature. Given my own academic background in STEM and business, I can say wholeheartedly that the kind of interdisciplinary and humanities-rich education that we offer at Victoria University must inform the technology and business know-how we need to address climate change. Humanities and STEM have always been good friends and, in fact, wonderful dance partners. They go hand in hand when addressing the world's most urgent issues. These are the values upon which we build and celebrate Victoria University and the University of Toronto, and we've been doing so for over 187 years. I know that we're all sorry that Stephen Coxford can't be with us this afternoon for this special occasion which he made possible. I am, however, very pleased that his family, including his wife, Kathy, and their two sons, Andrew and Peter, have joined us. And we certainly feel Stephen's presence in the room. I know he's here in spirit. Stephen has been instrumental at Victoria University, serving on the campaign cabinet for our Defy Gravity campaign and our major fundraising here within University of Toronto. This is, however, the second Coxford Lecture Series in Ontario. Our esteemed colleagues at Western University, and I understand there are one or two people from Western here, have also had the privilege of Mr. Coxford's generosity. I hope that you will now join me in extending our wonderful, warm welcome and gratitude to Stephen Coxford through his family. And now it is my absolute pleasure to welcome someone I had a chance to chat with earlier and really get to enjoy already, Mr. Mark Carney. Oops.
Do everything. Thank you very much, President McEwen, Rhonda, for that kind introduction. Thank you, all of you, for taking an hour out of your busy schedules, your afternoon, with a chance for some questions, but I'm going to speak for 40 minutes or so. And I'm a central banker, so I'll go over that agreement. I want to begin by reinforcing where President McEwen ended, which is just to pay tribute to the generosity of Stephen Coxford, his leadership, his dedication to the community, to this university, to university life, the pursuit of knowledge, and thank his family, Kathy and Andrew and Peter, for joining us today. The purpose of, as I understand it, these lectures and this lecture series, which will go on for a long time, regardless of the quality of the first one, is to trigger curiosity, spark new perspectives, and to encourage the amazing student body at Victoria College and the alumni as well to go out and use your talents to solve some of the biggest issues of our time. So the lecture series has a wide remit. It's to look at issues of public policy. I'm narrowing it somewhat, but only somewhat, to look at issues around tackling climate change, what's working, what isn't, illustrate the imperative of building consensus, the importance of governance, and the power of public policy, as well as the power of business. And in order to draw out how to address what is an existential problem, I'm going to roughly organize my thoughts around three themes. The philosophical and the practical, as it says up there, the global and the local, because it's obviously a global challenge, but we have to act locally, and the relationship between public policy and private action. And to give a bit of a preview, I'm going to try to stress really 5 points. And the first is the paramount importance, particularly for this issue. It's a point of broader application, but particularly for climate change, of purpose and mission. And if you're familiar with the work, some of you might be, of Nick Stern and Tim Besley, a Canadian, future Nobel Prize winner, you heard it from me first. The ideal in an issue like this is to define the core purpose very clearly and then determine the most cost-effective way of achieving it. The trick, of course, is forging that consensus, and then the debate should be about the best way of achieving it. And of course, with climate change, science makes our purpose clear. Net zero isn't a slogan. It's an imperative of climate physics. And further, the Paris Accord objective of less than 2 degrees isn't an arbitrary figure. Science and increasingly our lived experience, only have to have lived through the summer we had in Canada to know this, demonstrates the catastrophic impacts of further warming. The second core point is that we can't just achieve this objective, even with a strong consensus, by fiat or through some binding agreement. Because the net zero transition, it involves a wholesale transformation of our economies with immense consequences for our fellow citizens. We need global agreements, but they are guides, they're not binding. They guide governments. They have a mechanism for accountability, as I'll discuss, but national sovereignty is essential to develop legitimate strategies to mitigate climate change and to manage the transitions that accompany those strategies. And similarly, climate policies must deliver today for people while creating the conditions for the major structural change in the medium term. Now, all strategies, and I'm going to talk about those at the national level amongst international financial institutions, companies, and private entities, should be measured regularly against their objectives in order to ensure public accountability. After all, if we've come to a consensus on the goal, we all should be accountable for what we're doing to help achieve it. That provides accountability, but also encourages consistent improvement. And if we get this governance right, and I'm going to draw this out, we can create a virtuous cycle. I'm enough of a central banker to say one of the lessons of monetary policy, if you get it right, is you don't have to do as much if you don't have credibility. So the more credible and predictable policies are, the more the economy adjusts in anticipation, and the smoother the transition will be. And my final theme, and I'll draw this out a bit, but hopefully not too much for those non-economists, is that a net zero financial system is essential, but it's not a panacea. With the right incentives, finance does what it does well, which is look forward to the future, bring the future to the present, smooths adjustment, drives growth. Finance is a catalyst that can speed the transition. But I remember just enough of chemistry to remember that catalysts rely on their underlying components to work. And with respect to climate, the catalysts, so those underlying components rather, are the power of people demanding change, the policies of governments to incentivize actions, and the energy and innovation of entrepreneurs, businesses, municipalities, and civil society to deliver it. So I promised a bit of philosophy at the start, so I will give a bit. Hopefully won't be called out by the philosophers too much for the shortcomings. And as some might anticipate, my core point is that the climate crisis is a crisis of values, and the fundamental challenge is to create an economy in which society's values, that consensus, broaden the market's conception of value. If we can, individual creativity and market dynamism can be channeled to achieve our social goals. But there are paradoxes, and there's a difficult relationship between values and value. And to draw that out, I'll just allude to 3 famous paradoxes of value. So great minds from Plato to Adam Smith have wondered why water, which is essential for life, is virtually free, and diamonds, which have only a limited utility beyond their beauty, are so expensive. The core question, which I posed, which is, why do the markets rate Amazon, the company, as one of the world's most valuable, but the value of the vast region of the Amazon literally appears on no ledger until it's stripped of foliage and converted into farmland? And how do we reconcile, during COVID, our celebrations and support of the extraordinary public service, dedication, and heroism of healthcare workers with their low wages and perilous working conditions? And these are all questions of how we get what we value. Now, these concepts of value are rooted originally in theology, really in philosophy, and more recently and narrowly, and that's my core point, value being more narrowly defined in economic and financial theory and practice. Value isn't necessarily constant, but it's specific to time and situation. So the professor will again correct my allusions here, but Shakespeare's Richard III despairs in battle, a horse, my kingdom for a horse, given the peril he found himself in at that point. Or we can all relate to the value that we put on daily essentials during the pandemic. Over the centuries, there's been two broad schools of thought around value, the objective and the subjective. And objective theories contend that the underlying value of a product or a service is derived from how it's produced, and they focus importantly on how that affects wages, profits, rents. And so that's similar, slightly different conclusions, but similar whether it's Aristotle, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, or even Karl Marx. And those last three, they are so-called classical economists, and they have this perspective, this focus on the distribution and the consequences of value, because they lived, I would suggest, they lived during a period of unprecedented urbanization, industrialization, technological change, and globalization. And so they place the growth and distribution of value squarely in the context of those enormous social and technological changes that were then underway. And all of them would have found profoundly alien the view that's widespread today in the economic community, that economics is a neutral technical discipline that can be pursued in isolation of such dynamics. They would have argued that at a time such as ours, when the economy is being reordered through both the net zero revolution or transition and the AI transformation, that value theory, which values to pursue and how to distribute the gains, are more important than ever. And especially, there he is, especially because Adam Smith taught that values are not fixed. There's a central concept that links all of Smith's work. You know, he's caricatured as just being about the invisible hand, but his central concept across the theory of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations is that continuous exchange forms part of all human interactions. So it's obviously the exchange of goods in markets, but it's also the exchange of meaning in language, and crucially, the exchange of regard and esteem in the formation of moral and social norms. So in other words, he believed that we form our norms or values by wishing, and I quote, to love and to be lovely. That is, to be well thought of or well regarded. We receive feedback as we go through our lives from perceiving or imagining how others judge us. And this feedback creates an incentive to achieve a mutual sympathy of sentiments. And that leads people to develop habits and then principles of behavior. So the point is that moral sentiments are not inherent. To use the modern terminology of Richard Dawkins, they are social memes that are learned, imitated, and then passed on. Usually, like genetic memes, they can mutate, or in behavioral cascades and tipping points. So the conception of markets of Adam Smith should be seen in this broader social context. Markets are living institutions. They're embedded in the culture, practice, and traditions of their day. Those markets determine the distribution of value, which he believed, as Ricardo and Marx and Aristotle before him, is derived fundamentally from labor. Now, in the 19th and early 20th centuries, there were a group of economists known as the neoclassicists who launched an upheaval in the way of thinking about value that was comparable to the Copernican revolution in science. Copernicus transformed, of course, astronomy by moving its axis from the Earth to the sun, and the neoclassicists changed the perception of value from shifting the axis from the objective to the subjective. So according to them, people value goods and services that satisfy specific wants. And it's only because people value these goods that the inputs that go into them have value. Labor does not give goods value. Labor is valued because the good it creates is valuable. Value is in the eye of the beholder, not in the sweat of the laborer. And in the century since the neoclassicists, this combination, a combination of subjective value theory, it's in the eye of the beholder, a theory in which price equals value, and a cursory understanding of the invisible hand, in which markets yield optimal outcomes supported by unseen and unchanging moral sentiments, promoted a view that all market outcomes equal value creation, and through them, the growth of wealth and welfare of nations. And this perspective would eventually lead to an increasing imbalance between states and markets, and between social values and financial values. Now, there was much to commend, and this will be a controversial statement, but I'm supposed to provoke. There's much to commend, particularly at the time it happened, the Thatcher-Reagan revolution. But what it did is it fundamentally shifted the dividing line between markets and governments and unleashed a new dynamism. But fed by the fall of communism in the late 80s, the spread of the market grew unchecked. And so by the time I entered public policy and joined the G7 in the early 2000s, the conventional wisdom of market efficiency reigned supreme. And policymakers had nothing to tell the market. They only had to listen and learn. To put it another way, the market is always right. But as my central bank colleague and later Italian Minister of Finance, Tommaso Padoa-Schioppa, once observed, and I quote, "When we grant an entity infinite wisdom, we enter the realm of faith." Now, faith can guide, but it can blind policy. And such cognitive capture led to the self-cancellation of the policymaker's judgment, as only the market knows. It led directly to the financial crisis, and it has fed the climate crisis. More precisely, there are three risks that the combination of subjective value theory, price equals value, and market fundamentalism encourage. And the first is the familiar tragedy of the commons, which arises when individuals acting in their own interests undermine the common good by depleting a shared resource. So grazing lands in the UK in the 19th century, the cod fishery, which ended by the early 90s off the Grand Banks in Newfoundland, and is currently destroying our rainforests and imperiling biodiversity. Now, the second is the tragedy of the horizon. The first is a product of the market. The second is a product of human nature. We are irrationally impatient, and the catastrophic impacts of climate change will fall largely, not exclusively, but largely on future generations. So beyond the current news, business, and political cycles, leaving few direct incentives to solve the issue today, even though the sooner we act, the less costly it will be. In other words, for an issue that can only really be solved in the present, we have to value the future. And there are many solutions to this, and many have come in the last decade, particularly through the financial sector and stress testing, scenario analysis, but they all require new governance that I'm going to come to. And the last challenge is what I've been speaking about, which is a drift from the moral sentiments of Adam Smith to the market sentiments, maybe personified by Milton Friedman, where decisions are made purely in utilitarian calculations. So there is an advantage to the subjective view of value in that you can add up prices and compare them in a neutral way. And that's true for most things. But the disadvantage is that summing up prices with no sense of priority or sense of distribution and no weight put on that which isn't price, such as nature or biodiversity. This encourages trade-offs of growth today and crisis tomorrow, economics and health, and planet and profit. Okay, enough proto-philosophy. what about moving towards some of the practical solutions on climate change? And I'll put my cards on the table. In my judgment, my experience, given the scale of the challenge and the need for rapid, massive investment, and we're talking about increases in investment globally on the order of $4 to $5 trillion a year, which is an enormous sum. It's achievable, but it's an enormous sum. Any solution must include a major role for markets, because markets are the most powerful instrument we've ever created, and their energy and dynamism can be harnessed and directed to serve great purpose. Directed to serve great purpose being the key words. Because the market is also indifferent to human suffering and can be blind to our greatest needs. And that's why those, if they're in government, who worship the market tend ultimately to deliver policies that hurt people, and those who default purely to laissez-faire leave us unprepared for the future. Put simply, I could sum up to the last 10 minutes, markets don't have values, people do. And it's our responsibility to devise a way to close the gap between what we value as a society and what the market prices. And the Nobel economist, Elinor Ostrom, has documented how communities can come together to help manage a scarce resource through cooperation and prudent regulation. And now I'm shifting, starting at the global level. This is what UN climate change summits, or the COPs, seek to accomplish. They bring together countries, communities, companies to develop a consensus for sustainability, and then look increasingly to put the dynamism of the market in so that value is in service of values. So I said at the outset that climate change is a global problem that requires many local solutions. And I want to draw that out just for a second, because Danny Roderick, who's a professor at Harvard, has drawn out the fundamental tension that exists. In his example was in what he called the impossible trinity of globalization, where a deep mistrust of globalization arises from the conflicts between economic integration, democracy, and sovereignty. In other words, he's saying you can't have all three because you need common rules, and that seeds sovereignty. And if you don't have those common rules, it's hard to have the integration. So to maintain legitimacy, the process of agreeing any common rules in globalization must be rooted in democratic accountability. And this is something I have some experience with following the financial crisis, and through something called the Financial Stability Board, if you followed it, coming up with global agreed standards through a consensus process that most countries felt enough ownership in order to go back and implement. We need that combination of a shared objective, formal authority, informal iterative process, and transparency to create the virtuous circle of climate action. And this is a dynamic that has to operate at all levels, so the global, the national level of governments, and the financial. And it didn't start out that way. It started out with binding agreements, beginning with the Rio Summit in 1992. And for over 2 decades, the effort was to pursue binding agreements that would commit countries to act and impose penalties on those who didn't. The Kyoto Protocol, signed in 1997, bound 37 industrialized nations to specific emission reduction targets. And failures to meet those targets would bring penalties of further reduction targets and suspension from various provisions. So it was a textbook solution. It was an utter failure. It was an utter failure. It fell apart, part because the US failed to ratify the treaty, also because Canada, unable to meet our commitments, dropped out in 2011. Countries proved reluctant to pay large sums of taxpayers' money to pay for more efficient reductions in foreign countries. And attempts to revive it at the COP15 summit in Copenhagen failed. So, in effect, global governance needed a new approach. And that approach is found with Paris. I got a French flag here. And the first thing Paris does is get a clear consensus on purpose on the mission, which is less than 2 degrees, with pursuing efforts in to quote, pursuing efforts to limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial. And the genius of that agreement is how it balances this clear goal, numeric goal, with national sovereignty over the policies in order to achieve it, and includes some mechanisms through peer pressure, to raise ambition over time. To simplify, what it asks countries to do is a best efforts, their so-called nationally determined contributions, and then it adds those up to see how the world is doing. And through a regular stock take mechanism, it encourages them to do more. And of course, the role of civil society, fellow governments is essential to this, to raise ambition alongside. Now, the transparency over country pledges and these NDCs permit regular assessments. As I said, what Paris also did for the first time is it started to broaden the parties that were involved. For the first time, bringing in state and local governments, and critically, some of the private sector, a more limited amount of the private sector. But one of the most significant acts it did was to call to make financing flows consistent with the 1.5 degree pathway. And it acknowledged that the need to transform all of finance so that public and private money is aligned with the Paris goal. And one initiative that was launched there was the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. I'll speak about that a bit in the moment. And I see my colleague Brian Lawson here, who was instrumental in helping to implement that and other sustainability accounting from that early stage to bring it into the mainstream to give us a chance. And that is not an overstatement. So to simplify that diagram up there is at the global level, the governance of climate is clear objective, limit warming less than 2 degrees, 1.5. National sovereignty in setting the policies of Canada and other countries, regular assessment to see how everyone's doing, and then this iterative process to say do better. And of course, we do need to do better, and I'll get to that. What happens in Glasgow is a reinforcement of the core objective. Much less talk of less than 2 degrees, all the talk is 1.5 degrees. And part of that is the science and the lived experience, which is it turns out that it's parabolic in terms of the climate impacts of each 0.1 on the degrees. So in other words, we're running out of room, but we've realized that it's more important that we do more. Secondly, what's happened with Glasgow is this, that we get virtually universal coverage of net zero commitments. 90% of global emissions agreed over the course of the 3 years in the run-up to Glasgow, and then a spread through companies and financial sector. And with respect to the financial sector, something called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, which is 675 major financial institutions whose total balance sheets are bigger than global GDP, $150 trillion of balance sheet, commit to begin to manage those in line with 1.5 degrees. As well, what happens in Glasgow is a series of side deals on methane, on avoiding deforestation, phasing out coal. So not everybody agrees to that. Most of these agreements, you're trying to get 192 countries, and these side deals, you're getting 30 countries or 40 countries. Significant, and it's something to build on. And what happens in Dubai a few years later, just last December, is huge take-up of some of these side deals on powering past coal. So more come in. And on methane, which was niche, but through agreements in the oil and gas industry, not everybody, but 40% of global production agrees to net zero methane. As well, agreements to triple renewable capacity by 2030. So the focus in Dubai, and the key things about Dubai, it's all about the near term. It's all about measurable things by 2030 as opposed to by 2050. And in addition, bringing together the hard to abate sectors, so-called, sectors from aluminum to steel and shipping with specific targets. The punchline, if you add up all of those agreements in Dubai, is, and people implement what they say they're going to do, it's a third of the emissions gap between now and 2030. I mean, that is a huge jump. And we're going to know. We're going to know very quickly. And that feedback loop of peer pressure is going to be there. And the quite legitimate feedback loop of, well, there's 40% of the oil and gas industry has agreed to do this. What about the other 60%? Why haven't you agreed to do it? And that gap could close even greater. The final thing that Dubai does, and I wanted to touch on, is to address a fundamental challenge in addressing climate change, which of course is a global issue. And 2/3 of emissions now are coming from the emerging and developing world, and they're short of capital. And these numbers are very large. It's at least $1 trillion extra of capital that's going to be required. So we need a new system for that. We need a better combination of the power of the so-called multilateral development banks like the World Banks and loss-bearing capital underneath. And in Dubai, the hosts put together a facility called Altera. The name is not as important as the price tag, which is $30 billion, which has the potential to raise $250 billion in near term to help address this issue. So if you think about it, it's almost a quarter of that gap that's there in one deal. Okay. So what about private action and moving from the global down to the local level? So not surprisingly, shared mission. Canada has a 1.5 degree in legislation, so does the UK, so do others. And then that's the math on the gap, which I forgot about. And there is, I wanted to run through a few principles around how to make this work within country, talk a bit about the financial sector, and then I'll take questions. And what I put up there is really 5 principles, at least from my perspective, of how to think about how to unlock the market potential in country to make a difference here. And the first thing is recognizing that this is a whole economy transition. So we need to get capital, particularly to those industries that have heavy emissions. We can't just shut them down. To get capital, or if we're going to shut them down, we have to shut them down in an orderly way because there's people who work there, there's communities rely on them. They're part of the economy, and the feedback loop comes there. But we need to be transparent about it. Secondly, particularly in the energy sector, you need to ramp up the solution before you shut things down. So we do a lot of work in Southeast Asia where there's a need to shut down coal. Not one of those coal plants will be shut down unless the wind and solar plant is built first. It's not the toughest thing to figure out, but has to be there, and there has to be bridge financing for that. And the third point, I thought I'd put this up because it kind of bears focusing on, is we have scarce government resources. We cannot subsidize our way to net zero. And this is an analysis from the IMF, which is just looking at the punchline here is 40 to 50% of GDP is the additional cost if all of the weight of the adjustment were on subsidies as opposed to with a carbon price or regulation or some combination. So you can do some, but you can't do all. Because remember, that's happening at a time where there's greater demands on healthcare spending, on education, on defense, on policing. So we need to use those precious, in my judgment, fiscal resources to support households who need it the most during the transition. Things like targeted support for energy transition in homes, retraining for jobs. We should match that spending discipline with clear regulation on a forward basis to bring forward adjustment. And we should focus on carbon value for money. So if we're subsidizing the industry, where do we get the biggest bang for the buck in terms of reduction? And my last point is to really underscore the role the financial sector can play in all of this, which is because finance looks forward. If we have credible and predictable climate policies, if the argument is about not the objective, but what policies are in place, if the argument is, or if the standard is, if you're going to take something out, like the carbon tax, for example, if you're going to take that out, transparently and clearly put something in place that's better, that's going to have a better outcome. Because investment is happening, people are moving forward in a way that's consistent with the objectives of the policies that are there. And work I did with Janet Yellen before she got a better job was to draw out this point of how credible policy, working with a financial sector that has the information it needs to tell who's doing well, who isn't, who's trying, who's not, pulls forward adjustment and smooths adjustment. And in fact, just like in monetary policy, if they know you're going to do what you need to do, you don't have to do as much. That's the secret. I can say that now that I'm not a central banker. I'm going to say that. If you have credibility. Same thing with the carbon price. If you can anticipate, if you know where it's going, companies reduce their emissions today in order to be out in front tomorrow. And that's in part what we're seeing with the Inflation Reduction Act. We're seeing with things like moratoria, 2035 on internal combustion engines and others. So the last words I was just going to say just before I conclude is on the financial sector. And I think I had a previous slide. Ah, there it is, yes. And the punchline here is the Industrial Revolution was accompanied necessarily by a fundamental change to the financial system, centered in the UK. It's why central banks exist. We moved from a bank that just had a dollar here and could lend a dollar out there to banks that create their own money. That's what banks do, so-called fractional reserve banking, a new international financial system. We need something on a similar order of magnitude, and it's underway. And it's oriented around information tools and markets so that financial decisions take climate change into account. Now, sometimes it's irrelevant and sometimes it's decisive, but they take climate change into account. They take into account the trajectory of carbon. It's built on that financial disclosure, which was launched in Paris, the TCFD, which is the acronym, but is now becoming mandatory. It relies on transition plans and getting capital to where the emissions are. So not just green, but shades of green, if you will, in order to get emissions down. It relies on focusing on the emission reduction that comes. So in other words, on one level, it's quite easy from a climate perspective or from an appearance perspective to invest or lend to a software company. It's got a low carbon footprint. Therefore, if you look at my portfolio, there's not much carbon in the portfolio. The return, the gray there, there's my soundtrack arrived, is coming down there, is relatively modest in comparison to going to the steel company or the chemical company that has a plan and can do something to get those emissions down. And increasingly what you'll see, I think, is judgments on financial return, but also expected emission reduction. Because the left does much more for the planet than the right. The right just looks better if you don't look behind it. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with lending or investing in software companies, to be clear, but from a planetary perspective, you need that perspective. So just a quick stock take of where we stand, so I don't want to be too downbeat. The left-hand side is Paris. So at Paris, the world was headed to 3.6 degrees on various estimates. What countries said they were going to do was around 2.7 degrees, and you see the evolution of that through to Dubai, where policies that countries have is that 2.4 degrees. So there's a huge move in less than a decade. Not enough, obviously, and clearly, the country, there's a gap between commitments and actions still there. And the other glass half empty element, of course, is the carbon budget is being rapidly adjusted. I apologize, it's a bit busy, this slide. The punchline here is about 2/3 likelihood of breaching the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees by the end of this, certainly by the end of this decade. And already we have more than 3.5 billion people living in areas highly susceptible to climate change. And of course, we know some of the tipping points and feedback loops. Those are Canadian forest fires in recent years. You can guess the most recent one. So more positively, what we are seeing is an investment boom in this dynamic, this feedback, this looking forward on how do you get emissions down. And that's helping to drive growth. That's the sense. The key thing on this chart is the orange line is the average investment in, I'll call it oil and gas, pipelines, infrastructure, important for obviously our economy, but it's averaged just a little less than $1 trillion a year. If we went back to Paris, it was about half as much in clean technologies. Now it's almost twice as much. And the momentum is all there. And if you focus on finance and investment, it's where things are going, not where things are. So the scale is starting to get to a level or a trajectory that is consistent with getting on top of this. It's responding to these policies, these objectives, what society wants across various technologies, across manufacturing, and crucially, and I started with value and philosophy of value, what you see is that it's starting to show up in value. So companies that are improving their carbon footprint are getting higher valuations. And if you're just absolute relative to your peers, so you're a chemical company that has a lower carbon footprint than your peers, your value, the lines on the far right, have become much higher than they were 10 years ago. So this loop is working, and one would expect it to continue. And then the last point is the flip side of this, which is a little more awkward, depending on where you are, is we will be using, this isn't an awkward, this is a point of fact, we will be using oil and gas for a period of time on a 1.5 degree horizon, or not even if we're on that, absolutely. But the expectations of how much oil, this is gas as an example, that the world's going to use have changed quite dramatically. And this is just over the course of the last 5 years. These are the IEA forecasts. They won't be precisely right, but they're directionally correct. They used to expect that we would hit peak gas globally in terms of demand and consumption in the late 2040s. Now they think by the end of this decade. That is a huge move. That is a huge move. And that's a move that's consistent. It's mirrored in coal. It's mirrored in oil. It is consistent with a big, big shift in the energy sector. So last words. Too late for last words, but I'm going to force them in. So we're in a position where being low carbon is becoming a driver of value, a driver of competitiveness, jobs, and growth. And I would even argue, and this I'm quoting from, I'm going to quote Boris Johnson. I can't believe I'm quoting Boris Johnson. I'm going to be a clip, but he said, rightly, I thought, in a meeting in advance of COP to a group of 10 or so leaders, in the future, great powers will be green powers. And he's right. The thing about Canada is we can be a green power and we should be a great power. We can be the linchpin of these sustainable value chains that are being created in virtually every industry. Because we've got the prospect of a clean grid, because we have a great manufacturing base, great workforce, because we have the best trade deals linking us into Europe, the US, Mexico, Asia. We have a great track record of innovation. We've been an energy superpower. We can be a clean energy superpower with solutions from hydrogen to nuclear, including SMRs. And we can be the go-to partner for critical metals and minerals. So just to bring it back together, look, it is a huge challenge. But as we've moved from philosophy to practice, as we've moved from global to local, as we're building, and we're not there yet, obviously, but as we're building this combination of policy and finance and business, and crucially public pressure, we're creating the conditions for the enormous investment that's needed. So it's time to build. Simple message. That is not a top-down process. It's not trickle down. It's not top down. It's, it's inclusive. It's broad. It's everything everywhere all at once because it touches all parts of the economy. And to go back to purpose, we need to build, it's not government fiat, it's building as Canadians. It's the same in the US and the UK for them. And your contributions, hopefully you have a sense, I mean, you probably do anyways, but a sense of just the breadth of contribution the students of this great university can provide, which is everything from research in public policy, research in engineering, research in AI, practical applications of that, policy development, advocacy. Advocacy is crucial because it helps reinforce this consensus. Those of you who go into politics, again, it's crucial because that's how you translate the consensus into action, innovation, and yes, and in business and finance. So my only request would be to remember the purpose of all this, a more sustainable, livable planet for a stronger economy, a fairer society for our children and grandchildren, even your children and grandchildren, definitely my children and grandchildren. Let's build together. And thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much for that incredibly thought-provoking and information-rich talk. My name is Ira Wells, and I'm the Academic Programs Director here at Victoria College. And it will be my pleasure to officially thank Mark Carney in just a minute. But we are going to go now to some of our Vic 1 students who have questions prepared for Mr. Carney. Just say your name.
Hello, Mr. Carney. I'm Anya. So regarding your speech, and you've mentioned about the Paris Agreement. So recently in the news, it's been reported that Canada is not meeting the targets, and it hasn't met the target of cutting down greenhouse gas emissions by 40 to 45% as laid down by the Paris Agreement. So what is your opinion on this, and why do you think it's happening? Like, why can't Canada really meet the target?
Okay, great question. First, and as part of the point of my speech, it's incredibly important that you ask that question, and the Canadians continue to ask that question. Why are we not getting? And if, in fairness, if I can say to Canadians, Canadian government, is the 40 to 45% is for 2030. So we're not there yet, but you're absolutely right that the projections, the expectations, given the policies we have in place, given everything that's happening, is we haven't done enough. We haven't done enough together. So it's incredibly important. And then the challenge becomes to ask, our governments, and it's, the federal government, the provincial governments, even municipal governments, but what are you doing to help close that gap? Challenge businesses and finance. Are you part of closing the gap? And it's that dynamic that should help force change. Look, I think the part of the story, and I won't make it too long, but part of the story is it's only in the last few years that we've really gotten a more comprehensive climate policy that has a degree of credibility. And so now the stakes are getting higher on that because, as is fair, we have a political process, we always do, and people will say, well, I want to change this or I want to do that. And I think the challenge should be just neutrally, okay, if you're going to take something out, what are you going to put back in that's going to be more effective, that's going to close that gap? And I'm not just going to take your word for it. I want somebody objectively to make those judgments. In the UK, by the way, there's something called the Climate Change Commission, which objectively makes these assessments. And then the other challenge we have is we have an industrial base and an energy base that has very high emissions. And we need to be, in my judgment, much more deliberate about helping to get those down. And there's some good ideas around that, but we need to get on with implementing those ideas. Yeah. Oh, it's a spicy row here.
Hi, thank you for your lecture, Mr. Carney. I'm Neil Natu, and do you think Germany and the rest of Europe should go back to nuclear energy given the current energy crisis in Europe and that they were heavily dependent on Russia? Thank you.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, in a word, yes. I don't. I mean, and I say that in the following respects. There's a fairly wide range of modeling of how the world could get to net zero. There is no scenario that does not have nuclear that is at least 8, 10, 12% of the energy mix in 2050, first point. And that energy, and it's a world where we're using much more electricity, obviously, as we swap from fossil fuels. So the aggregate contribution from nuclear is that much bigger, first. Second point, actually extending the life, and you've got to do it right. And we have issues, it's an issue here in Ontario with Pickering and Bruce and others where we can extend the life. You've got to do it right. But it's the cheapest form, virtually the cheapest form of energy. It's not the cheapest thing to build a new nuclear plant, but to get it right and use it. And Germany has the opportunity to do it. It has a consensus at this point that suggests it won't. I think we'll see different choices made elsewhere in Europe and elsewhere in Canada. And I do think, and we're seeing it now with some announcements in Saskatchewan, with what's going on here in Ontario, what Hydro-Quebec talked about a few weeks ago, even in Quebec, where there is a role for nuclear, and particularly large-scale nuclear, but also what are called small modular reactors, as you probably know, which can, particularly with our economy, which is quite spread out and in some cases remote, can really provide a solution.
Hello, thank you for your talk. My name is Avery. My question for you is, and I know you alluded to it briefly in your talk, but what are the respective roles countries which are currently undergoing industrialization play relative to countries that have already industrialized?
Yeah. So it's a great question. So that's, I'd say a couple of things. One is, in some respects, it's an opportunity, just like, and this is an overstatement, I'll admit, but just like the leapfrogging that happened in places in Africa, emerging Europe, et cetera, with the advent of, before your time, there used to be things where you had to have a wire on a phone that connected, this is how I remember, and the dial, et cetera. And the leapfrogging that happened with mobile telephony, whether it's Romania or Kenya, et cetera. So there is a bit of an advantage in new industrialization, and there's huge risk, to say the other way around, if you're industrializing as an emerging economy and you're locking in carbon intensive processes, you're running a huge risk of those assets being stranded. So there's an advantage, there's a challenge. Part of the issue is capital, which we're working to solve. And part of the issue is and the world is moving in fits and starts. I didn't have a chance to go through all this, but on forms of carbon pricing, not just a carbon price, but for example, the ability to sell steel into Europe, it's going to matter how much carbon is in your steel, in the steel process to deliver it. So product specifications, and that will happen in across industry in fits and starts over time. So that's my answer. I'm sticking to it.
There's much more that we could discuss. I hope that you'll join us for coffee and tea in the lobby. If I may just usurp your spot. I just wanted to end with one more note of thanks for Stephen Coxford for having the vision and the generosity to support this today, which would not have been possible otherwise. I'm sure that many of us will be reflecting upon aspects of Mr. Carney's remarks in the days ahead. I was personally struck by your crisp formulation of the drift from moral sentiments to market sentiments, and your call to close that gap between the two will be in my head in the days ahead. I'd like to close with a few words from Mr. Carney's timely book, Values. If you've had a chance to read that book, and everyone should, you'll know that Mr. Carney explores specific concepts of value in economic theory and their financial applications. And in the final pages, he turns to think about the intergenerational transmission of values in the broadest sense. And he closes with some stirring words that I wanted to share with you. So this is now from the book. I'm quoting to Mr. Carney from himself. There are no places for us in the crypt of Westminster Abbey. Even if there were, with the centuries, our accomplishments would be forgotten and our names would become puzzles. But our moral sentiments can live on as memes that multiply through values in the service of others. A worthy past sedimented into a better future. Mr. Carney points out that in the vast sweep of human history, even the best known individuals are bound to be forgotten. But their values will survive, just as the values of our own intellectual ancestors continue to permeate the institutions and our communities, and even the ideas that we may experience as our own. It's an inspiring idea. When leaders and ordinary citizens make choices that strengthen our ethical commitments, we contribute to a shared moral DNA that will live on even as our individual names become puzzles for future generations. Please join me in thanking Mark Carney for his inspirational words, for so articulately and persuasively sharing some of his values with us today, and for encouraging us to live up to our own.